Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks so much for the invitation and the interest in learning about curriculum and developing a curriculum that's going to best serve your needs. I hope I'm able to provide perhaps a starting point for those looking to get into this work and maybe some helpful tips and planning processes for those who maybe are a little bit further along. So to start, I'd just like to tell you a little bit more about me. I'm a third-generation settler who was born and raised largely in Kitchener on the Haldimand Tract within 6 miles of the Grand River. This is traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples, and it was land promised to 6 nations by the Crown. This photo here in the bottom right is a photo of a bridge on the Grand River that's close to where I grew up. For me, it's really symbolic of my childhood. It reminds me of, a lot of my first memories, spending time in nature, walking and canoeing along the Grand River, and also just driving over this bridge seemingly anytime we went anywhere. That's how it felt when I was a kid. I also have here a picture of the French River. Here's a place where I spent a lot of time, again, as a child and still now as an adult, surrounded by nature. And I really think my time in this place is what really helped foster my environmental passions. I pursued schooling in biology, first at Laurentian University in Sudbury, and then at Mount Allison in New Brunswick, where I studied these wonderful birds here on the bottom called semi-palmated sandpipers. And I studied them in the context of the tidal mudflat ecosystems. So when I reflect on that, I think perhaps it was really the first time in my life that I really thought and studied about a whole interconnected system. Everything from the composition of the mud itself, working with engineers who are looking at, the particles in the mud, how large the sizes were, all of these really interesting things about the mud itself, to the bugs that lived in the mud, these birds that ate those bugs, and then, of course, the birds that ate these birds. So it's really fulfilling time for me. And following that schooling, I returned home, ultimately, eventually to Kitchener. And so I have a picture here of a butterfly and a salamander, which really represents the next part of my journey, where I spent just over 10 years working in a nonprofit as a biologist, conducting long-term monitoring of many species, these 2 in particular. And it was during this time that I returned to school and studied education and specifically curriculum development at Western University. So I spent about 10 years supporting program development in outdoor spaces, often taking somewhat inaccessible sort of academic, scientific papers and language and trying to create experiential programs for different age groups that helped translate that scientific information to an appropriate audience. And then this last picture here in the top corner, me holding a snake, this really represents my role now with Ontario Nature as Conservation Science Manager, where I get to work with a lot of great projects with a lot of fantastic people, and at-risk snakes being just one of those fun projects. So I know everyone comes to this space with different learning goals and different knowledge and experience. So what I'm going to do today is hopefully provide a really early introduction to the topic of curriculum development, really from a Western academic lens based on, my schooling. And I'll bring in elements from my outdoor ed experience when that's appropriate and interesting as well. And then we'll also hear from another speaker through a recorded video after, and that will share, Janine, she is going to share a lot more about designing lessons around traditional teachings, which is very interesting as well. So this is an outline of what I hope we can cover today. And of course, if there's topics we don't cover, if there's things we don't go into enough or other areas you hope to learn more about, please, we're always open to hearing those. We'd love your feedback, and hopefully we can continue to support and have follow-up sessions that maybe tackle things at a deeper level if needed. So for me, as I said, I will cover, the basics, and I'll start really with what is curriculum and how and when can it be most helpful to us. So a curriculum is really a roadmap or a plan or a framework or a blueprint, whatever term you want to use to describe it, that details what is going to be taught, how will it be taught, what are the expected outcomes, and how will they be assessed. Curriculum can really help improve learning outcomes by ensuring that learning builds progressively upon itself and that lessons stay aligned with your learning goals. We often hear the term curriculum applied to these like institutional education systems like school boards, where they outline a collection of lessons, academic content, and materials that are used to reach standardized grade level goals. But curriculum can be a really useful tool for even a single course or lesson, particularly if it's going to be repeated with any sort of frequency. How detailed or formal your curriculum needs to be really depends on what's best going to support you as an educator, the learners in your space, or the needs of your program itself. So it can look like this. It could also look like this. It doesn't have to be onerous to you if it's not what you need. And when we think about curriculum, I hope we think about it as a resource and not a mandate. So while it does provide structure and consistency to your program, it can also be adapted over time, and it can be built and should be built to leave space for teachers to adjust the pace, the content, or the methods based on the learners. So curriculum can look really different depending on your needs. And this is really important, especially when we think about unexpected learning opportunities, which is especially applicable if you're designing a program that takes place outdoors. I'm sure we've all been in this situation. There's no guarantees when it comes to what might cross your paths when you're on a nature hike or you're leading an outdoor program. And so it is important to be prepared to see nothing, and also leave space to enjoy the opportunities that do arise and meet the friends that you might encounter along the way. This red fox here in the bottom picture was seen at our youth summit this last fall, and it was very exciting sighting for everybody to have that special moment to share and enjoy. And I've also just had great experiences with youth out in the land, and I think especially as a biologist, if you're working with species all the time, you can start to, I guess, you're not excited by the common things. You've seen them a lot. And I think being in education spaces, I'm kind of thinking about youth, but I think with any education spaces, you get to share that enjoyment and that excitement of first time sightings and the joy of common sightings. I just think of this time where I had a sixth grader who was just so over the moon excited about seeing a squirrel go into a hole in a tree. She said she'd only ever seen squirrels in like urban parks and on streets. And so seeing it in like a forest setting, going into its home, it was a really special experience for her. It's something I'd seen many, many times, but getting to experience that joy sort of through her eyes, I think is a really special part of being an educator in outdoor spaces. So I want to touch on how curriculum can be most helpful to a variety of different audiences. So I'll start with just the obvious, I guess. How can curriculum support educators and teachers? And it does so in a few ways. One, it really allows you as an educator to focus on delivering quality and authentic programs. When you have clear goals laid out for you and all the support's already in place and organized, you know how the program is going to be assessed or how you'll assess the learners. You don't need to reinvent the program every time, and you can really focus on that delivery. And that's can be very key for educators in both traditional sort of classroom settings and also non-traditional spaces. So for educators, can improve their delivery, also allows them to effectively use the time and resources they have. They know what's going to come next. They have this fully fleshed out roadmap in front of them. And it helps educators ensure they're prepared for what's to come, and knowing that you can bring the knowledge that you need to the lesson, and you have a good understanding of what knowledge the learners are bringing into the space as well. And you know what your goals are. So it really helps you be prepared, use what you have available to you as effectively as possible, and deliver great programs. And then, of course, that has really important cascading implications for students. Depending on the curriculum, sometimes they're written more for educators in mind, but even the Ontario school curriculum, it has associated parent guides. So if you're a student or a parent looking to learn more about the information, while the curriculum could be pretty stuffy and use a lot of jargon, there's these associated guides where you can really see as a learner or a parent what's expected of my learners, and those clear expectations can really help different students. Also, just collectively having a more prepared teacher who's focusing on delivery means the learning lesson is probably going to be more enjoyable for the students as well. It can boost engagement. They have this sort of pre-planned knowledge that's going to stack, and so it really helps the learners in that space as well. And then finally, a curriculum can also be beneficial for your organization, your institution, your community, your program, whatever sort of terminology makes sense for you. It can ensure consistency, that you're teaching, the same type of program and the same content over time. And it can also help identify resources or materials that you need, areas where support's needed, maybe you need specialization, and it can help you evaluate your goals and help demonstrate that you're meeting those goals, which can be really important as well. So while not every program or every lesson or every outreach needs curriculum, sometimes it can be supportive, even if it's just kind of a simple framework. It doesn't have to be completely fleshed out with lesson plans and activities all the time, but it has benefits in a lot of ways. So I'm going to touch on now the information that's typically included in a curriculum. These are very common elements, but not everything might be needed in every circumstance. So again, you have to consider your own program needs. But typically, you're going to begin with a learning goal. What do you want your learners to know, be able to do, or understand at the end of the program? This is key. And then ideally, this would include specific and measurable. This would be specific and measurable, but again, that's not always appropriate depending on your program. So some examples of sort of very broad, high-level potential learning goals are things like, by the end of grade 4, learners should be able to complete their 1 through 12 times tables from memory. Or following participation in training, learners should be able to identify 5 different snake species by sight and explain 3 conservation threats that they face in Ontario. Or by the end of the lesson, learners will understand the importance of polyculture of the Three Sisters farming practice or garden. These are all examples. Obviously, different programs have different needs, and these could be made much more specific, but gives you kind of a general idea of the type of learning goal that you might see. So once you know your learning goal, then hopefully the other pieces all continue to tie back to that central goal. So other components to consider include, of course, the content. This is the subject matter that you'll cover, what knowledge and skills are valuable and relevant for your learners to meet their learning goal. So if you're teaching kids the times tables, you're teaching them math, you're tying in all your curricular content here to meet those needs. And then as well, very important is the instructional strategies you will employ. What methods are best to deliver the content and facilitate the learning that you want to do? So this is things like there'll be lectures, there'll be discussion groups. Maybe I want group projects. Maybe it's going to be a mentorship style of learning. Maybe it's going to be hands-on experiential. All of these types of broad categories are things you might as strategies you might assign based on the content and the learners that you have. And then next is assessment and evaluation. What tools and methods will be used to measure the learner's progress? This can be very formal things, exams, tests, assignments, presentations, all of these kind of things. And in a traditional setting, you might be grading or marking for a student. That's how they're going to be assessed to see if you're meeting your learning goal. But that it doesn't always have to be that formal or that traditional. It could be, check-ins with a mentor or elder. You're having these conversations regularly. That's how you're assessing sort of the learning curve of the learner. Lots of different avenues here, depending on your program, but it's important to reflect on this piece, even if the reflection is we're not evaluating. That's not a part of this program. That's also valid, but should be explicitly kind of understood going in, because it'll impact your curricular development. So in most cases, these three elements, along with your learning goal, are going to be the framework of your program. We have our outcome that we know we want to achieve. We have the content that we're going to teach to get there. And at a high level, we know our methods that we're going to take to teach that content. Then we can drive down a little bit further, and these things might be things that you identify in your curriculum, or they might not be necessary, depends on your needs. But learning activities is something that might be identified. Compare this to content. These are to content and instructional strategies. These are really getting to the meat of the matter. This is the nitty-gritty sort of lesson plan. We're going to do an activity to plant a seed. We are going to do a group project where the youth make a collage. Whatever it is, your actual learning activities, your lesson plans, the specific experiences your learners are going to have. That's what happens here in this learning activities stage. And again, depending on sort of how you're coming into the work, often in sort of smaller outdoor ed groups, you're designing the curriculum and you're also delivering the curriculum. So you might have these really fleshed out lesson plans. In a broader sense, like for the Ontario curriculum, it's not always so prescriptive. They leave room for teachers to develop the lesson plans based on the content. So there's wiggle room here. You don't have to be overly prescriptive, but you can be if it makes sense for you. Next, of course, is what materials and resources are going to need to support your learning. Think textbooks, computers, medicines, microscopes, butterfly nets, art supplies. The list is really endless. Anything you need to actually support the delivery of your program are things you want to list here so that you can plan accordingly, purchase what you need, fundraise for what you need, whatever it could be. And then the final point here is the learning environment. This is another one that's not always explicitly stated as part of curriculum. I think often because like in the Ontario curriculum, you won't always see this because it's kind of built around classroom learning. But again, in non-traditional spaces, this is often something that I think is important to touch on. Think about what kind of space that makes most sense for the learning you want to do. So it could be something like saying, we need to be in a space that's big enough for everyone to be able to move around. We want to be able to stand in a circle where everyone can see each other. That's important for this program. Or we need to be outside where there's large trees for shade and for program, or we need to be near water. This is an opportunity for you to specify if a certain environment or space is needed for your work. And so all of these pieces, all of these things are sort of the pieces that you want to put together when you're designing curriculum, and the curriculum development process is how we go about making these decisions or finding this information and putting it together into a cohesive plan. So I'll jump into that now, and I'll reiterate again that there really is not one right way to design or develop a curriculum. And if you start looking online for steps of curriculum development, you'll find a lot of different ideations of basically these 4 general steps. Some people split them up. So, gather is in multiple phases, design's in multiple phases. But if you lump them together, it's basically these 4 key things that you want to do. And I'm going to start here at this gather phase, but I'm going to jump in with an assumption here that we already know our learning goal. We have a program or a lesson in mind. We know what our learning outcome is that we want, and we're gathering information to design a program around that. If you're not at that step, if you don't know what your learning goal is, you're not sure, you want to fill a void, but you don't know what that is, then the first step might be a needs assessment. And that could be worthwhile if you are looking to fill an education gap, but you're just not sure what your learners or your community or your organization needs, what that gap is that exists, then you might want to consider a needs assessment. But for what we're talking about today and where we are, we're going to jump in at sort of, we know our learning outcome that we want to achieve. And so we're going to start by gathering, by the gathering phase. And when we're in that gathering phase, we have our learning goal that's telling us what we want our learners to know, be able to do, or be able to understand at the end of the program. We now want to ask a few more questions of ourselves and gather more information to be able to support that goal. So a few important questions to start with. Who is your learner? This could be as simple as saying classes of grade 7 students, very simple. Or better yet, it might be a class of 20 to 30 grade 7 students, because your approach might change depending on, how many people you have in the space as well. It could be 15 adult community volunteers is your audience. It could be a group of new Canadians. It could be anything, right? Obviously, it depends on your program, but defining who your learner is really going to help you make a lot of these decisions and plans. And so the next question is, what else do you know about your learner? What knowledge and experience do they come into the work with? So you might want to pause and reflect about that. If you have a class of grade 7 students, you're making an assumption. They're coming with all of the knowledge of, kindergarten through grade 6 with them. You can understand sort of where everybody is, and you can build a stacking program based on that existing knowledge. That's not always the case. Maybe you're working with a group of new Canadians and you're trying to help people engage with nature in a space they're not that familiar with. Well, then you already know your audience is coming to the table, with not a lot of comfort or familiarity in that space, and you're making adjustments for that as needed. So it's great to reflect about who your audience is and how you can best support them and fill the learning goals for your learners. In the example of community volunteers, for example, is it a group of community volunteers that are all brand new? You're starting from the very beginning. Or is it a group of volunteers with a mixture of experiences? Some have taken place, some have participated in your program before or have done this before. Some are brand new. Well, you might adjust your learning model based on that. Maybe you're going to take that into account. And then finally, you want to ask yourself, will the learner be assessed and how? So again, that same content that we talked about before with assessment, the answer to this might be no, we're not assessing. That's not part of this. That's fine. But if you are, or it's still good to kind of talk these things through. Will the learner be assessed? How will that happen? Are they going to be assessed just on their participation and something that happens along the way? Or is there an end product or result that is going to be, the culmination of the lesson, and that's the structure. So additionally, in the gather phase, you want to document any of the components of your program that are fixed. So maybe you're doing an outdoor program. Maybe it's going to be hands-on learning. Maybe your organization or the approach you're taking is already fixed because that's something that your group does really well. So in the gather phase, you want to document all of that. What's locked in? What do we know we're doing? And so that we can build everything around that. And for some education settings during this phase, you might also want to consider and gather information on the abilities and passions and interests of the educators and knowledge keepers you're working with. Does someone have a preferred communication style? Are there accessibility concerns you want to be aware of? Are there strengths of your educators that you want to lean on? So these things are all really important. And I think back to an example where I'm not a musical person. I love music, but I have no musical talents or abilities. So it would never occur to me to build a program that, incorporates music, because that's not a skill or ability of mine. But I was working with an educator who really had a strong passion for music and could connect with the learners on that level. And so we were able to really come together and build that into the program where, we bought ukuleles and he was developing songs about the learning with the youth. And it was a really great opportunity that just wouldn't have been in my sphere at all. So it's great when you're able to take those things into consideration. And like I mentioned before, how sometimes your curriculum isn't super prescribed. If you think about the Ontario school curriculum, they're saying, here's what you have to teach, here's your learning objectives. And then they, for the most part, let the teachers develop the lessons based on their own abilities and what they know. So it's great to kind of pause and reflect on that at any level. What special talents are people bringing to the work, and what are their passions that they can share? And I always like to see things like that come together. So the gather phase in a nutshell is really, we want to outline what do we already know about our program and what do we still need to figure out or decide. So then we move on now to the design phase. We know who our learners are, we know what they hope to learn, and we know all the predetermined aspects of our program. So we're ready to dive in and design the rest of the program from there. And there's multiple approaches to consider when you're doing this. And largely it comes down to taking one of these approaches or often a combination of these approaches. So you can consider designing your curriculum with a subject-centered approach, a learner-centered approach, or a problem-centered approach. So I'll just break those down a little bit further. If you're taking a subject-centered approach, this is basically when your program is about a specific subject matter or topic, and you are building your program in a way to best deliver that information. This often applies to really more generalized activities. Think sort of traditional classroom style learning. It caters to a variety of learning styles. It often gets used when you're dealing with big audiences of learners and you just may not have the ability to cater the program to individual learning needs. So just think about learning math on a classroom chalkboard. You're going to have pop quizzes. You're going to have repetition. These are sort of tried, tested, and true methods that work for most, but not all. And in a subject-centered approach, you're really going to think about your subject matter and how do I best hammer that home and take that strategy. You can also take a learner-centered approach. You're still teaching a subject matter. You still want to teach those kids their times tables, but instead of catering it to what's maybe most efficient and broadly applicable to your subject matter, you're going to teach the content in a way that's catered specifically to your audience. In this style, you're likely dealing with a smaller group, possibly with a specific need. Often this type of curriculum needs to have more detailed instruction associated with it. And maybe you need to know a little bit more about your audience going in as well. We typically see this with smaller classes and fewer students. Maybe it's a group of students that have, same learning style that have all been put together. You could be working with, a small group of new Canadians, or you could be working with like a summer camp where you have a smaller group of kids with maybe a variety of ages. And so if you had that, you might want to, make sure the kids are getting their hands dirty. Maybe you want to pair up young and older kids together so they have this opportunity to engage where the older students can teach the younger students because you have this mixed grade. So learner-centered is really thinking about the learners first and how to teach the content to them in the best way. Where subject-centered is thinking about the subject first. How can I most efficiently deliver this information? And then finally, we also have problem-centered lessons. These, introduce issue for the learners to solve, and often it's much more interdisciplinary. You have a big question, and you're going to ask the learners to tackle that with their own skill sets, and they might bring in a lot of elements to do that. Probably a little bit of math if that's your subject matter, but they might also have to, communicate with one another, and maybe they're going to bring in some other elements to try to solve this problem that you've centered the lesson around. So these are really broadly 3 strategies. Very typically, you'll find you're doing some combination of these things. So based on the approach that you've decided on, you are now going to develop the scope and sequence of your program. What topics are going to be taught? So you've got your content, at a broad level, this is all the content I want to deliver in this program. And I know the program is 3 hours or 3 months, whatever it is. And here's, the pace that's going to go. We're going to start with this. Then we're going to move to this knowledge. Maybe you're splitting it up into units or lessons or modules or stations, depending on the scope of your program. And usually you want to be consulting maybe with specialists in different areas. You might even be consulting with the learners during this design phase. And you're setting typically some type of measurable objective kind of in sequence. So basically the building blocks of your program, you're charting it all out. What's the path the learners are going to take, and what are all the stops along the way? How will we measure all of those stops if we are measuring it? And you're thinking about things like, how is the content going to be accessed? What materials will you need? You're starting to do all of these sort of design phases, and it's hard to dictate exactly what that looks like, since it will really depend on the content and the learning outcome that you're working on. So then we kind of get to go to the fun parts. Now that we have our design, we build and we evaluate. So during the building phase, this is when you're making your lesson plans, you're purchasing your resources, you're building your PowerPoint presentations, your activity books, whatever it is, you're actually putting together all of the content that is ultimately needed to succeed in your plan. And sometimes that means you're maybe going back to your design days a little bit as well and tweaking along the way. And nothing exists without growth. That you want to build, and then you want to evaluate, implement your program, get feedback, evaluate it, revise it, evolve it. Learners change, what we know and understand changes. Adjustments are a normal and important part of the process. And so with any program, it's great to build in those sort of timelines that you make sure there's room for your program to grow and improve. I'd like to touch on a few age-appropriate sort of considerations here, because I know there's mostly people in this space that are maybe dealing with a variety of different learners, and I think non-traditional settings. But there are some considerations of how you'll deliver your content based on the age group of your learners. And so these are some very high-level thoughts, but of course, there's lots of different ways to approach this. So if you're dealing with young people, I sort of classified this as elementary age. Typically, you take a student-centered approach, or sorry, this should say, learner-centered. I changed the terminology there, but learner-centered approach, because you're dealing with typically young kids. They don't have high attention spans. You really need to cater the content to something that's going to be engaging to them. Hands-on activities are really great. Consider short interactive lessons with frequent breaks. As much as possible, hands-on activities that are multi-sensory are really great. Get the kids thinking in different ways and experiencing things in different ways. And depending on the age, especially for very young kids, having your program be play-based is also something that can be really effective. So consider visual aids, routines, repetition. All of these things are important for young kids. So try to think about doing a high variety, shorter activities with repetition that can be successful for this age group. And if we go a little bit older and we're thinking of sort of high school aged kids, we tend to switch gears here to be a little bit more subject-centered, although sometimes it can be problem-solving as well. At this age group, there's a lot more emphasis on critical thinking. Students tend to respond to a lot of inquiry-based learning, which is great. And it's a great time to encourage peer collaboration. It's not just about the knowledge that's being shared at this age. It's also a lot about working together to achieve that, and peer collaboration can be really important. And we also love to give the youth at this age, opportunities to apply their knowledge. Can you teach them something and then they teach it back to you? Are there presentations or reports or ways that you can reinforce the learning by having them teach it back to you, or teach it back to other peers or younger learners as well is great. But it's great for assessing understanding at this age group, but it's also a great way to engage this age group to bring them into those experiences. And then if you're educating as adults, it can be very different, because adults are very different from one another. But often we might take a problem-centered approach when working with adults. Adults bring in their whole life experience to programs, which is amazing. And so you often want to leave space for that dialogue back and forth. You're bringing some type of knowledge to the table, but often in an adult group, they're also bringing knowledge to you as well. So creating space for that knowledge exchange in these types of programs is really great. And people love to share about what they know. So that's a really great way to engage with people as well. So you can try dialogue style, discussion style, engagement. And I also find with adults, I mean, this is somewhat true with all people, but especially with adults, I find they really like to know the big picture. How is what they're learning or doing impacting, like how is that impact being felt on a broad scale? And how is it being applied to the real world? I find these are things often adults want to know about the program they're participating in or the learning that they're doing. And then my last point here is just about accessing the Ontario curriculum, if that's of interest to you. If you are developing a program and it's something that you want to align with the school curriculum, then like if you think you're going to bring in youth groups and classrooms, it's a great idea to try to align it with the school curriculum because you might get funding that way, or you might tap into an audience that way. You could fill an educational need that way, which is can be really great. Again, totally depends on the needs of your program. You do not always have to do this, but I just wanted to point out that the Ontario curriculum is available online. You can go on their website and you can download all of their curriculum documents. I will say they're not the easiest things to read because they look a lot like this, where it tells you sort of the overall expectations for all the students by the end of the course, but then it also breaks each one of these things down into, more building blocks. So when I was working with an organization that developed outdoor programs for school groups to send their classes to, it was very important to align to the curriculum. That's how you attract teachers. That's how you get the support of the school board to want to send their kids, and you're sort of checking those boxes for people. It's great to try to tie it to these components, but again, not always necessary. So that's all I have for you today. I think I'll leave it there. We are going to do an activity where we sort of walk through those developmental questions that I mentioned in my presentation, but I'll turn it over to Christine. We're going to watch another presentation first.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jenna. I learned so much from you. I'm definitely going to pick your brain about this for our youth program. So there's so much to sink in and use for our program. So I am super excited to introduce our next speaker. Janae Graffam is a member of the community Sagkeeng First Nation and is an Indigenous educator. Janae currently resides in Thunder Bay. Janae's teaching experience includes teaching in Indigenous community and at Indigenous-led schools at both elementary and high school levels. She is currently employed by an Indigenous Health Access Center, working to develop and deliver culturally focused youth programming with guidance from elders and knowledge keepers. Janae is also a member of the Youth Circle for Mother Earth's Coordinating Circle and has voluntarily led land-based activities and mentored youth through our annual Youth Summit. She was unable to join live, but has put together a recording of her experiences as an outdoor educator. So without further ado, here's Janae.
Bonjour, Indigenous Sagkeeng N.Da.Waab.Jig. My name is Janae Graffo. My clan is Bear Clan, and my community is Sagkeeng First Nation. I'm currently located in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is the area covered by the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850 and home to the people of Fort William First Nation. My presentation today is teaching with Indigenous ways of knowing. Just some things we're going to go through: introduction, your school environment, some teaching resources, some cross-curricular connections, implementation, and a conclusion. So just a little bit about me to start off. My experience is teaching in an elementary school in a First Nation, Whitefish Bay. So I've also taught high school in a First Nation focused school in Kenora, Ontario. I currently work as a health programs coordinator, so I develop programs similar to what I'm actually talking about today for youth age 7 to 17, based on healthy eating, active living, connection to culture, living smoke-free, diabetes education, and culturally relevant programs as well. So we're incorporating Indigenous culture into all of the programs that we deliver. We're working with elders and we're working with knowledge keepers through this process. So why incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into your classroom? So number one, advances truth and reconciliation, doing your part to work on the calls of action. Number two is promoting holistic education. So promoting education that has these cross-curricular connections and being able to for students to make these connections throughout their learning experience. Supporting environmental stewardship. So Indigenous culture is highly focused on the environment and the connections in the environment, and looking after our environment and taking that ownership to keep our environment sustained and keeping it clean. Encourages Indigenous language revitalization. So that is a huge one. Indigenous language can be incorporated into any subject area. Excuse me. So that's something that you could be working on as an educator as well. So within our school environment, I wish I was doing this live because we could chat about what we already do in our school environment, but we want to make these meaningful experiences, and I like to connect it to the five senses. So sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. An experience doesn't have to cover all of these, but if it covers maybe 2 of them or 3 of them, it's a really memorable experience for the youth. For example, if they're hearing Indigenous language on their morning announcements, or even taking part in that by doing the morning announcements themselves, whether they are coming into the classroom and learning, being able to touch the cedar, a traditional medicine, and smelling the tea that can be made from that, even tasting it. So there's lots of meaningful experiences that you can do. A lot of the ones that I like to do when I was teaching, or even today in my work, is land-based learning. So taking the students out in the land, and often you can experience all of the senses when you're doing that. So first, I'm going to talk about a few valuable teaching resources. So the medicine wheel is one of the ones I want to talk about. So the medicine wheel, here's an example from SCODE. So these are just some areas that can be applicable to a classroom or to a school in the medicine wheel right now, but it actually can be adapted to a lot. There's lots and lots of different teachings that can be applied to the medicine wheel, like the 4 directions, different animals, seasons, groups of people. You can use it to talk about aging, health, and many, many more. The next resource that I want to talk about is the 13 moons. So this represents the cycle of life in the natural world. This is kind of like the calendar that Indigenous people would use. And each moon is 28 days, and it's named after a season or an aspect of nature. You can see the Indigenous language in each of the moons there. So the moons, they teach us about seasonal changes, they teach us about animal behaviors, they teach us about agriculture, when's a good time to harvest. So I would like to note that, again, I'm in Thunder Bay, and this is a resource that was created by elders and organizations in my area. I would encourage you to look up if there's any resources in your area. Same with the medicine wheel, like it can change. I'm just going to go back for a second. This is the medicine wheel in my area. It could change between different areas. And the teachings with that can change as well. So different elders are going to have different teachings, and I'm going to go into that a little bit. But next is the 7 grandfather teachings. So these are the ways that, as Indigenous people, how we live our life, and very important sacred teachings to us. So these teachings could also be applied to a classroom. an opportunity on integrating classroom rules and expectations, how we treat each other in the classroom. Can also connect to curriculum, whether you're talking about different animals, an opportunity to research animals, habitats, Indigenous clan systems, and connecting with elders and knowledge keepers is a very valuable resource. Each elder is going to hold different life experiences and different knowledge. So it's important to ask an elder if they have experience in that area or if they're comfortable talking about that, and to follow proper protocol with providing tobacco before asking an elder for knowledge to be shared, potentially offering an honorarium, and taking care of elders when we have them visiting us. So making sure that they're well looked after, providing whatever they need, maybe even transportation for elders. So next, I'm going to go into some cross-curricular connections. So giving some examples between how an activity can tie to many areas of the curriculum. So why we want to do this, to create these rich and learningful meaning experiences for students. When I think back to when I was in school, these are the kind of things that I remember, the things that I could actually go out on the land and get my hands dirty. And being a teacher, I know that these are the things that my kids remember. So fostering creativity, collaboration, and connection to the world around us engages students in a variety of learning styles. So, excuse me, I'm just going to go over some of these examples of lessons that I have actually done or programs that I have developed in my organization. So this one is an example of a lesson. So Walk on the Tundra, picture books can be used for any grade of students. Teaching high school, they actually really loved when I would do a lesson with a picture book. Obviously, the lesson would be more complex than an elementary class, but this specific picture book was really great because it has Indigenous language, and it talks about Arctic plants with a little girl going on a walk with her grandmother, and it includes a field guide and scientific details of the plants, which I thought was really awesome. So an opportunity for language in here is learning the language in the book together. So science and physical education, investigating the plants around our schoolyard is something you could do with your kids. Researching plants for maybe older kids, creating a medicine garden. So harvesting cedar or medicine that you might have near your schoolyard or in your schoolyard, and researching Indigenous plant medicines. What are the plants? What were they typically used for in Indigenous culture? That sort of thing. Geography, so an opportunity to look at where the tundra is and the environment there, maybe some animals that can be found there. History, so learning about Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, as an example of the grandma and the story, and maybe even inviting a elder or knowledge keeper into your classroom to talk about maybe one of their experiences or to share knowledge. The next one's a very, very simple one, making bannock and traditional Indigenous food. This is something that I do with the youth from grade 2 all the way to grade 12 in my programs right now. So it provides a meaningful opportunity to introduce students to Indigenous culture, talking about where bannock came from, developing these practical life skills. So including like measurement related to the curriculum, following instructions, procedures, teamwork, culinary skills. So I recently did this in a grade 2 classroom, and a student said to me, "I don't get to cook at home. Like this is a really great experience," and I thought that was really special. So learning about where bannock came from, we have a little lesson on this in the program that we offer. So it talks about how different areas, different groups of Indigenous people would use different materials from the land. prior to European contact, prior to flour being available. So that's a really cool learning experience. Mathematics, like I mentioned, like measurement and numbers. Science, discussing how Bannock changes states throughout this process. Health and physical education could be related to health, talking about how maybe healthier ways to make bannock, deep frying versus baking, and Indigenous food sovereignty and food resources. Language, students are communicating their following directions. We've done this in a small group setting, which tends to work really well with a helper kind of at each station if possible with the younger ones. And students reflecting on the experience, maybe a journal entry. What was your favorite thing about this experience? Tell me what you learned. Next one is art in nature. So creating art with the natural environment is another lesson idea. This is one of my favorite things to do. Again, it can be used for a lot of different grades, and the complexity can just be adjusted depending on what grade you're doing. So students can develop a more personal connection to the land through art. So how we do it is students are collecting materials off the ground floor, the forest floor. We've done it in the schoolyard as well. So they're collecting all of these materials, and we make sustainability and land conservation and protecting the land kind of key topics in this. So students will be not damaging trees, not pulling bark off trees, not ripping out the grass. So we talk about how we want to honor and protect the land, and we just want to use the resources we kind of find on the ground to create this art. So I've seen some really great art by students through this. I've done this a lot. And we always talk about the land that we're on and Indigenous principles similar to sustainability. So protecting the land, we want the land to last for a long time, and we want to just use what's kind of left for us on the ground to create this art. So that can be related to science due to the sustainability aspect of it, and talking about the traditional lands we're on, and exploring maybe treaty relationships within those lands, talking about the treaties that we're on. And it can be tied to maybe history, art. So we're using a lot of different mediums, whether that's rocks, sticks. I've seen it done with snow in the wintertime. So it can really be done anytime, and it's a super neat experience. Language, so sharing about your personal connection with the land, reflecting on what you've created and what it means to you for students. So that's the art and nature activity. Next is traditional games. So there are a lot of Indigenous traditional games, and I'll share that resource with you and with Christine. So Make the Stick Jump is one of our youth's favorite games. So it's very, very simple to set up. So it is sticks in a line. They have flags on them in the photo, but typically we don't use the flags on them. We'll just put some electrical tape on the top of the stick, and we'll do a lot of different groups. So maybe we'll do 3 groups or 4 groups with these sticks in a line. And what traditional games do, before I get started into explaining the game, is they help youth understand cultural history and values of Indigenous communities, whether that's teamwork, whether that's practicing for hunting for Indigenous youth before they go out on the land and hunt, practicing their coordination and balance, that sort of thing, and really learning to work together and collaborate. So back to this game, there are a bunch of sticks lined up in a row, and the youth are lined up behind the line. And we use actually moose hide balls to play this game, but it can be played really with any ball. Maybe something similar to a hacky sack is what we use. So youth are in a line and they're throwing the balls at these sticks, and they want to knock them down. They want to be the first group to knock them down. versus any other group. So youth are taking turns, they're throwing their ball, they're going to the back of the line, the next person's throwing their ball, they're going to the back of the line, and it gets a little bit competitive, and youth tend to love this. So another one in the winter that we do is snow snakes. So though these are like wooden dowels, they have a weight on the end, and you create a track for them just with a shovel, and you throw them through the snow. So so these games come from different Indigenous groups. So for example, the Make the Stick Jump comes from the Blackfoot group. So this is an opportunity for youth to learn history. So where this game originated, who played this game? Was it played by little children? Was it played by older children? Mathematics. So practicing as we knock these sticks down, we're counting how many sticks did we knock down? How many sticks did that group knock down? What is their strategy? For social studies, talking about why these games are important. A lot of these games are actually training youth to hunt, like I mentioned before. So maybe talking about how food was harvested and why these skills are important, or were very important at the time. Health and physical education. So youth are always moving when they're playing these games. And language, again, reading about the maybe what the game was called in Indigenous language, or reading about the group of people, or learning about the group of people that where this game originated, or even reflecting on the experience, another opportunity. Number 5 is talking about water teachings. So water is a key element and very sacred, important element in Indigenous culture. So I know there's World Water Day, so there's an opportunity right there coming up here in the new year. So allowing students, again, to have this deeper connection with Indigenous culture and truly understand the relationship with the land and respect for the land that Indigenous people have. Environmental stewardship and sustainability are key areas that can be connected to this topic. So understanding the connectedness of water and life. So learning Indigenous language, an opportunity to learn the word water in Indigenous language, listening to the water song. So it's a hand drum song, can be found on YouTube. I will also share that with you. So that's something that I do in my work today. So we have a set of hand drums, and we drum and sing in classrooms with the youth and teach about the sacredness of the hand drum and the respect that we use caring for our hand drums. So that's another area that I do in my work. Science, so learning about how copper was used in Indigenous culture to purify the water. Learning about water conditions in Indigenous communities and how many communities today still don't have clean drinking water. Learning about the history and the cultural significance of water and women's roles. Women are traditionally called water keepers, though it is everyone's responsibility to care for the water. So sharing those teachings with the youth, researching the water walkers and seeing movements on the drive people have to advocate for this clean water, and learning about ceremonies. So maybe having an elder in and talking about what happens in an Indigenous water ceremony. Health or physical education. Maybe you teach your students about the water walkers, or plan a walk in support of the water close to World Water Day. Just to show students that to do your part in supporting clean drinking water. Next is using the sacred medicines. So there's 4 sacred medicines in the medicine wheel in Indigenous culture, but there are many more medicines in Indigenous culture. Tobacco is one of these medicines. So there's a lot of different uses for tobacco in Indigenous culture, but all of them are cultural, spiritual, and medicinal. So communication, to seek guidance, to show gratitude and respect, those are all uses for tobacco in Indigenous culture. We use tobacco when we're asking for knowledge. We use tobacco when we are taking something from the land, we're always going to say a prayer and put tobacco down to say thank you to the land. Health is another area that we can talk about tobacco. So right now in our organization, we talk about living smoke-free. So we talk about the difference between commercial and traditional tobacco. So teaching youth the difference between the two, because sometimes youth don't know the difference. They think tobacco, they think commercial tobacco, because it's so widespread in our society. But teaching youth that medicinal tobacco or sacred tobacco is medicine for our youth. Exploring chemicals added to commercial tobacco, or growing your own tobacco. I see some classrooms doing that today for the youth, which is super awesome. So growing their own medicine or starting a medicine garden. History or social studies is the next one. So talking about the history of tobacco in Indigenous culture and learning the process of how commercial tobacco started, how it was being traded and used in a non-traditional way by people who were new to Canada. Indigenous people have been using tobacco since the beginning of time. And it wasn't until settlers came here that it began to be used in a non-traditional way. So using traditional tobacco, teaching about traditional tobacco. So even using the language there, Sema is tobacco. So having students create a poster even is another language opportunity or language arts opportunity, explaining the difference between commercial and traditional tobacco based on what they've learned. So implementation plan, how can you start? You can use the resources and begin your own research. How is the medicine wheel used? How can you apply this lesson to the medicine wheel? Maybe reaching out to Indigenous organizations, reaching out to elders, considering these cross-curricular connections. So you have a lesson plan. How can I relate this lesson to Indigenous culture? How can Indigenous culture into my lesson? Reviewing your resources and reaching out to elders and knowledge keepers. So again, reaching out, seeing how you can reach out, contacting your school board, seeing if there's elders that they typically call in to share knowledge. Plan and implement these meaningful experiences. So implement experiences where students can use many of their senses, these memorable experiences, taking students out on the land, doing things like making bannock in class. So those are the things that students are going to remember. So I just want to talk about quick how Indigenous teachings differ between language areas and knowledge keepers. For example, hand drumming, the songs are sang a little bit differently an hour away from where I am. So things are always changing, always different, always going to be different depending on who you talk to. So I just wanted to share that all teachings are valid, and this is a principle that when we go into classrooms that we respect. We always love to hear other youth's teachings and have an open mind, because not everyone's teachings are going to be the same. Different people hold different knowledge, and just being respectful that and keeping that in mind. If you have any questions, feel free to email me as well. So in my position currently, we have 14 classroom programs that we have delivered, which all connect to the curriculum, whether that's like art-based, cooking-based, more science-based, traditional knowledge-based. So if you're interested in seeing our classroom programs list that we kind of have with a little description, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to share that with you to give you maybe some more ideas on how you can incorporate Indigenous culture and Indigenous knowledge in your classroom. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and thank you Ontario Nature for inviting me to present today. I hope I was able to give a few educators some ideas, and yeah, miigwech.
Yeah, so that was Janae. She did send me a list of resources to share with everyone. So we'll be adding additional resources to this list, including ones on language revitalization. So if you'd like to share any resources that you have in mind in the chat, that we send an email. We will also have a question in our evaluation forum.